Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Last week I began my series evaluating Druid spells. In that video I analyzed the Druid cantrips, and this week I'm moving on to first level spells. I will be reviewing every spell using my standard rating system, and here is how it works. If I rank a spell as red, I think it's a bad spell. I wouldn't recommend it for preparation on basically any Druid. If I rank a spell as orange, I think it's a very circumstantial spell. This is a spell I wouldn't recommend to prepare normally, but there are going to be situations where it could come in handy. So if we know that the circumstances where the spell is good are going to come up, then it is worth preparing. But if we don't know that, I probably wouldn't. If I rank a spell as purple, I think it's an okay spell. These are likely not the first spells I jump on when I'm doing my preparation list, but I think you can get reasonable value from them if you do prepare them. If I rank a spell as green, I think it's a good spell. This is the kind of spell I would consider very strongly when choosing my spell preparations. Now, I don't necessarily consider a green spell as a must-have, but if you do prepare it, you're likely going to get a chance to use it, and you should get reasonable value from it. If I rank a spell as blue, I think it is a fantastic spell. I would have a hard time passing up the chance to prepare the spells I rank as blue. The blue spells are the best of the best. Now, if you are colorblind, I will be adding stars to the end of each rating, 1 for red, 2 for orange, 3 for purple, 4 for green, and 5 for blue, so it should be easy to discern the color ranking. And if you're just listening to the video, no problem, I'll be announcing each rating as well. If you enjoy this content, consider joining my Patreon. Patrons of this channel can see these videos early and non-monetized, and my top-level patrons join me for some D&D every month. Check out the link in the video description. Today I want to recognize these top-level patrons: Airhead, Alexander Razin, Rob Reichelt, Anna, Aurelio Christian, Awesome Face, Ben Potts, Benjamin, Black, Bloody Nine, and CJ. Thanks so much for your support. Let's get started. Now, before I get into the ratings, I do want to discuss the strategy of putting a preparation list together. Because now that we're into leveled spells, what spell preparations we choose are irrelevant. The best preparation list is not going to be a list of all my highest ranked spells. Ideally, a spell list is first and foremost versatile, so look to avoid layering up spell preparations that do similar things. Instead, put together a spell list that can give you something valuable to do in as many different situations as possible, and you'll be better served. Spells that work well together also belong on the same preparation list. The value of a spike growth, for example, increases if we have ways to push and pull those enemies around the spike growth. So that is something to think about when you're putting your preparation list together. The last piece of advice before we get into the ratings is remember that every spell I go over in this video is available to any Druid character. You can change your preparation list after every long rest, and you can choose from any spells of a level you can cast on the Druid spell list. So I encourage you, take advantage of this. Change your spells. Try new spells out. It's not only more fun to change things up, but I have found that different players in different campaigns get more or less value out of certain spells. So best bet is to just try a variety. See what's right for you and your Druid, or just keep switching and keep your DM guessing what cool spell you're going to be casting for the first time in your next session. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if you just go through these videos, take the highest ranked spells and plop them on your preparation list without any thought, you're gonna find that there's spells that you never cast, or spells that are redundant, and there's going to be significant gaps in what you can do. Knowing what spells are good and not good is just a starting point when you are determining what spells to prepare. So let's go through the Druid spells. I'm going to be evaluating first level spells today, and I will be working right up to level 9 with a video every week on this same day until we're done. These are just being presented in alphabetical order. And this is the first video where we're going to have spells that were added to the Druid spell list in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and I just want to make it clear that I am reviewing those spells as well. But if you're not using the optional class features from Tasha's, then of course those spells aren't available. So I will mention when I go over those spells that they were an optional added spell. The first spell we're going to go over, Absorb Elements. This spell uses your reaction to cast when you take acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage. When you cast it, you gain resistance to the damage type that lasts until your next turn. So potentially you could keep that resistance through multiple instances of that damage type. Then, if you hit with an attack with your melee weapon on your next turn, target takes an additional d6 damage of that same type. So the part with the melee weapon attack I don't find overly useful. Often our druids are not swinging around melee weapons, and we're talking about an extra d6 damage. That probably isn't going to make our druid suddenly good at melee. Secondly, if an enemy is delivering, say, fire damage, there's going to be naturally a greater possibility that the potential targets of that damage might be resistant or immune anyways. Not for sure, but, you know, it's far more likely. Upcasting this spell, by the way, just increases the potential melee add-on damage by not even that much, d6 per level, so I would say this is just not a good candidate for upcasting. The big thing here, I mean of course, is the damage resistance itself. The really nice thing here is this just gets better as we go up in levels. There's no upcasting required to make this spell better. For example, if we're at lower levels, we might use this to soften the blow of a Black Dragon Wyrmling's Acid Breath, and that probably is going to prevent somewhere around 11 points of damage. But at higher levels, we might use this to soften the blow of an adult Black Dragon's Acid Breath, and then it's more likely to prevent around 27 points of damage. I also find that elemental damage in general is more commonly faced as we increase in levels. There are a couple pitfalls to bear in mind. The first of which is just be aware of the damage types this works against. This does not help you against poison damage. That one I see all the time, players thinking they can use this to resist poison. You can't. You can't use it to resist necrotic. Just acid, cold, fire, lightning, and thunder. Second pitfall I see quite often is there is an instinct to immediately cast a spell if you've got it prepared and you take any of those damage types. I really encourage you to consider how much damage it's going to prevent before throwing a first level slot at the damage. Honestly, I have lost count of the number of times I've seen this cast to prevent, you know, anywhere from 2 to 5 points of damage, when that kind of damage was nearly irrelevant to the character, and they could have healed a lot more than that with a first level slot. But overall, this is a good spell. Absorb Elements is the only reaction spell a druid has on their entire spell list, and that makes that even better for your action economy. This may be more valuable on your preparation list once we get to mid-levels than at level 1. I'm not sure I'd jump on this at level 1, but overall, this is a green spell. Our second spell is Animal Friendship, which is definitely an iconic spell for druids. This is an action casting, and you target a beast within 30 feet, which then makes a wisdom saving throw, or it's charmed by you for the spell duration, which is 24 hours. Upcasting this allows us to target an additional beast with each time we upcast it. There are 3 problems I see come up with this spell all the time. The first problem is that some non-beasts seem a lot like beasts. So you come across an Ankeg, or a Guardian Wolf, or an Ice Toad. You might think Animal Friendship is a good option, but those are monstrosities, not beasts, and so the spell fails. Now, even if your DM is nice and lets you know the spell doesn't work, I know I certainly do, it can create disappointment in the player, as the opportunity to use a spell you normally don't use, and you thought, in this case, it might be clutch, and it's lost, and so there's some disappointment there. Second problem I see coming up with this spell is the intelligence limit of 3 or lower on the target, or the spell automatically fails. This isn't a problem most of the time. Most beasts have intelligence of 2 or 3, but if that giant ape is about to attack, be aware it has an intelligence score of 7. The giant octopus has 4. If you cast the spell on these enemies, it automatically fails. These happen to be two of the tougher beasts, by the way. The biggest problem, though, and I see this not just in gameplay, but in out-of-game conversations as well, is a lack of understanding as to what the spell does in the first place. It imposes the charmed condition on the target. That gives you, the Druid, advantage on your social ability checks made to interact with the creature, which I assume are going to be based on charisma, which frankly is probably not your highest ability score. And that's only if the DM calls for those social checks. Charmed also prevents the target from attacking you, but not from your allies. It can still maul them. What this spell does not do is give you control over the creature. It does not provide you a pet for 24 hours. Now, you might have a nice DM that just gives you those things, but the spell itself doesn't provide them. It makes your social interaction checks with the animal more likely to succeed, and the animal won't try to kill you, and that's it. And that alone may be occasionally useful. But social action ability checks for dealing with an animal may come up, but they aren't common. There's potentially some utility use here, especially if we have a way to communicate with the animal. But there is actually a lot of DM fiat in what kind of information a squirrel can provide beyond, "Hey, I'm hungry, give me some nuts." This one is orange, because we can definitely come up with some scenarios where it'll be useful, but I wouldn't expect them to be regular. And I think a lot of people think this spell does something that it just really doesn't do. Our next spell is Beast Bond. This is a touch spell and lasts up to 10 minutes using our concentration. The target needs to be a friendly or charmed beast with the same intelligence restriction as animal friendship, and yes, this can be combined with that spell. This provides telepathic communication with the beast, and it gets advantage on attacks against creatures within 5 feet of you that you can see. I remember when this first came out, and there was hope this would be kind of the Beastmaster fix. Then some people punched some math, and yeah, it was not. But with a Druid, well, the only Druid that has a built-in pet is the Wildfire Druid. And that's an elemental, so it doesn't work. That means you need to find a friendly beast in the first place. And even if you do, there needs to be a mechanical advantage in using the slot and maintaining your concentration for this to be worthwhile. And I just don't see that coming up very often. But, you know what, as an irregular thing, sure, maybe if you're playing Tomb of Annihilation and suddenly a Triceratops turns out to have taken a liking to your party. A low-level Druid using concentration to provide enhanced communication with that creature potentially provided advantage on that 48 plus 6 attack. They're probably going to get good use out of a first level spell. So I think this ranks orange. I think a lot of Druids will not find a suitable use for this spell, but some will. Our next spell is Charm Person. This spell is on a lot of spell lists. I think a lot of players already know kind of what this spell does. You select a humanoid within 30 feet and you cast a spell. Target makes a wisdom save, with advantage if you're currently in combat with them, and if they make their save, nothing happens. If they fail their save, they gain the charm condition, and they treat you as a friendly acquaintance. That's something I want to point out that's different than the charm of animal friendship. In the case of Charm Person, target regards you as a friendly acquaintance on top of the charm condition, because the charm condition doesn't automatically do that for you. When the spell ends after 1 hour, or if you or your companions harm the target, they know they were charmed by you, and they're not likely to be very happy with you. You can upcast a spell to affect multiple targets. The save advantage makes this really not a good spell for casting in combat, because your reliability here is going to be terrible. So we're down to utility, and there's some pretty hefty limits there too. The humanoid restriction is big. The creature knowing they were charmed afterwards is a significant limitation. And also, keep in mind this isn't mind control. You can't make a charmed creature do something it just normally wouldn't do. Think of it as them seeing you as a close friend whose advice they respect. That's basically the kind of influence you can expect. Again, just really circumstantial, and an orange rating. Our next spell is Create or Destroy Water. This is a one-action casting that allows you to create or destroy 10 gallons of water. So our uses here include filling water containers if we're in a scenario where water scarcity or clean water scarcity is an issue. Creating rain that extinguishes flames in a 30-foot cube. We can destroy water in a container. You can't destroy water in a lake or ocean apparently, unless you put it in an open container first. Or destroying fog in a 30-foot cube. We can upcast this for more water created or destroyed, or increasing the area of effect by 5 feet. Most of the time, I would imagine the first level spell is solving the problem you're dealing with. So let's get to the obvious circumstantial stuff. If you're lost in the desert, you obviously want to prepare this. And based on that alone, I would have normally considered this an orange spell. But there is something cool here. Normally, spells that extinguish fires or that kind of thing, they specify it's limited to non-magical fires. This spell doesn't seem to have that limitation. Same thing for removing fog. Apparently, that can be magical fog too. Now, I think we can question whether a 4th level wall of fire that has all its exposed flames extinguished doesn't just immediately respawn them afterwards, because there is no fuel burning. The magic is just generating the flames out of nothing. But against something like a fog cloud spell, or any spell that creates magical fog, like a cloud kill spell, the way I read this, you would take a 30-foot cube chunk out of them with this spell. So that's pretty cool and could be very useful. Now, every single use of this is still circumstantial, but those different circumstances kind of pile upon each other, so I do think a purple rank is appropriate. This is still circumstantial, but there are more circumstances than an orange rank might imply. Next spell is Cure Wounds. This is an iconic spell, and I don't see it taken very often, because why would you take Cure Wounds when you could just take Healing Word? After all, Cure Wounds requires an action to cast, it's a touch spell, and the actual healing of Cure Wounds versus a Healing Word isn't going to be all that different once you add your Wisdom modifier in. So maybe you heal 7 or 8 with Cure Wounds, and maybe 2 less with Healing Word. Well, I think there are cases where Cure Wounds might be the better spell to prepare. Now, I wouldn't prepare both of them. I think that's totally redundant. But if my Druid had a really good bonus action, maybe I'm a Wildfire Druid, for example, I could potentially use a Cure Wounds on an ally that went down, then use my bonus action to have the Wildfire Spirit teleport us both out of harm's way, and do a bit of damage to the remaining enemies I left behind. And I just wouldn't be able to do that kind of combination with a Healing Word. Now, in regards to upcasting, Cure Wounds is a far better spell to upcast than a Healing Word. But if you are considering upcasting either of those spells, I think first I would check out how your DM interprets the aid spell. Because if you can increase a target's current hit points with aid when they've already benefited from an aid spell, then it is going to be better than either Healing Word or Cure Wounds upcast at hit point recovery. But in regards to aid, I've heard it argue both ways. I'm going to go more over that when I get into second level spells. Out of combat, I don't think Cure Wounds is anywhere near your best option for healing. But in combat, it can sometimes be effective. But even then, I wouldn't be reaching for it right away. Often in D&D, damage avoidance is more effective than damage recovery. But, for example, you have a barbarian in rage, and the enemies are focusing damage on them. Sometimes their hit points are just kind of getting whittled away pretty slowly. And in that kind of case, a one-action cast to restore some hit points might be worth it. Naturally, when a party member is down, a spell to bring them back up is pretty much always worth it. So, Cure Wounds ranks purple. I think it's going to be worse than a Healing Word more often than not, but it can provide largely the same function, and there are cases where it's the better of the two. Next up, Detect Magic. This is a one-action casting that you can also cast as a ritual if you take 10 minutes. It's concentration and allows you to sense the presence of magic within 30 feet. You can also use your action to see an aura of magic around creatures or objects bearing magic. And if they have a school of magic, like maybe that book has a glyph of warding spell protecting it, for example, you would learn that as well. You can also detect magic through full cover if it isn't lead, up to a foot of stone, 3 foot of wood or dirt, or 1 inch of metal. So this spell is just super useful. I generally would want at least one character in any party to be able to cast this at any time. It's a great way to find anything from magical items to magical traps. And ritual casting means we can cast this without using a spell slot. My recommendation is talk to your other players. If nobody else has taken this, then prepare it, and it will be a great investment. This one is a green rank for me. Our next spell is Detect Poison and Disease. Again, this is a one-action casting that you can also ritually cast using 10 minutes to save a spell slot. This also lasts for 10 minutes using concentration and also has a range of 30 feet. While active, you can sense poisons, poisonous creatures, and diseases in range. You can identify the specific kind of poison, specific kind of creature, or specific kind of disease as well. And this doesn't even use your action. Like Detect Magic, it can work through barriers of the same thickness. Now this mechanically works very similar to Detect Magic, but I think you'll find the circumstances for this less common. But you know what, still common enough, I don't think this is a bad spell. Sometimes you find potions, and normally they're identified through sipping them. Casting this beforehand may save you sipping a bottle of poison. Maybe we're in a spider-infested cave, and they're all concealed in the webs, and there are webs everywhere. This spell would alert you if any are within 30 feet. It would also alert you what kind of spiders you're dealing with. Disease, though. D&D does have mechanics for disease, but generally I find they don't come up very often. If you're thinking of mummies, mummies inflict curses, by the way, not diseases. Being that this is a ritual, which gives us the option to take the extra time to cast it without expending a spell slot, and there are definitely lots of poisons in D&D, I think this ranks as purple. So in regard to preparing this, let's say you have a druid, and the party wizard has the Detect Magic ritual already, and I had a preparation slot available and I was looking for a ritual, this would be a contender for that spot. Next up is Earth Tremor. You cast this using your action, and all creatures within 10 feet of you make a dexterity saving throw, and on a failed save they take d6 damage and they're knocked prone. On a successful save nothing happens, not even half damage. If the area around you happens to be loose earth or stone, the area becomes difficult terrain. This is a good example of a lousy spell. The damage is terrible. It is anywhere from half to a third of what I'd expect from a first level spell, and those spells would give you half damage on a successful saving throw. This one's even worse than that because they take no damage if they save. You can't exclude your allies from this effect. And frankly, surrounding yourself with difficult terrain is not necessarily good if you were planning to move. And if you're surrounded by enemies and you're not going to be doing very much damage to them and there's no allies around, you probably wanted to move. You can upcast this to increase the damage by a lousy amount, and I don't see that ever being a good idea. Though I don't think it's a good idea to prepare this in the first place. Knocking enemies prone can be useful, but hopefully we aren't finding ourselves surrounded by enemies and no allies, and even if we do, this isn't the spell that's going to save you. This one, it's red. I just don't think it's ever a good idea to use a preparation on this. Next up is Entangle, a one-action cast that requires your concentration and lasts up to a minute. So with this spell, you pick a 20-foot square on the ground within 90 feet of you, and it becomes difficult terrain for the duration. Now that's not a 20-foot radius, it's a 4x4 square. Each creature in the area when you cast a spell makes a strength saving throw, and on a failure they're also restrained by the spell. There are no additional saving throws, but restrained creatures can use their action to make a strength ability check and try to free themselves. Now, the restrained effect in this case can only happen to creatures who are in the area when you cast the spell. So after that, creatures can pass through the entangled area with the normal difficult terrain double movement, but there's no saving throw versus the restrained effect. Also, a creature that frees themselves from the entangle, they are not going to get restrained a second time. Now, there are spells that are somewhat similar to this that are just better. Web, for example, is a better spell. But the thing about Entangle is it's a first level spell. This kind of area of effect, combined with something as useful as the restrained condition, is just not something we see with first level spells, except for this one. And that's on any spell list. Targeting strength isn't bad either. A lot of typical enemies we fight at low levels just don't have good strength scores. And since there's just the one saving throw, if a creature is restrained, at worst, we end up eating their action as they try to get free. In terms of first level area of effect battlefield control and debuffing, this is the crown jewel. And this spell is only available to druids and rangers if you're using Tasha's optional class features, but only druids can access it at level 1. This tends to be the first spell I want to take with my first level druid. Now, as we level up, there are going to be other really good area of effect battlefield control and debuff spells that we're going to want to take. And at that point, I might reassess if I want to diversify my spell options. But I would also consider that although creature strength scores tend to go up as we increase in level, proficiency in strength saving throws is still relatively rare. So I don't think this ever becomes a bad spell, especially for a first level spell. But at lower levels, I am absolutely grabbing this, and I think it's blue. I think this is excellent considering the level, and I highly recommend it. Our next spell is Purify. This has some similarity to Entangle in that it's a one-action casting and lasts up to a minute with concentration. We have a bit less range with this one, 60 feet, but we cover a 20-foot cube, so creatures don't necessarily need to be on the ground. Creatures in the area make a dexterity save, and if they succeed, nothing happens. If they fail, though, they shed light in a 10-foot radius for the duration. Objects in this area also shed this light. Now, firstly, this prevents any benefit from being invisible. And secondly, attacks against creatures or objects lit up have advantage, which is honestly going to be the reason, more often than not, we cast this spell. But I have also seen it used to attempt to reveal invisible creatures, which can be potentially useful. If it is a single creature, though, it's one of those spells where if they make their saving throw, it doesn't do anything. For a first level spell, Faerie Fire can be pretty good. You definitely want to hit several creatures with it, so at least some fail their saving throw. And it works a lot better if those creatures are high armor class in the first place. We also may not see a lot of value from this on a bunch of fodder. If you cast this on a bunch of creatures you were likely going to hit anyways, and you were likely going to take down with a single hit anyways, then the value of this, why did you bother? But if this spell is well used, it's pretty good for a first level spell. I would rank it green overall. That brings us to Fog Cloud. This is an action cast that uses concentration and covers a 20-foot radius, so that is a big area for a first level spell. Fog Cloud is not useful in every combat for every party. Here are the primary uses of the Fog Cloud spell. First, if our enemies are attacking us with advantage for any reason, or we are attacking with disadvantage for any reason, or worse, even both, we can use the Fog Cloud spell to cancel all of it out. Second, we remove line of sight, which can block some features of monsters, as well as spells that require you to see the target. Thirdly, since Tasha's provided a combat style that gives 10-foot blind sight, we can use it to significantly buff these allies, often providing them both advantage and imposing disadvantage on attacks against them. And those are the uses. And as I mentioned, Fog Cloud isn't always useful. In fact, it can be terrible. You can cancel out your own party's advantage, or cancel disadvantage on your enemies. You can block your own party's sight-based spells, or it could just do nothing. You need some kind of circumstance, such as those I previously mentioned, for Fog Cloud to be appropriate. I have seen Fog Cloud cast when it is completely useless, but that doesn't mean the spell isn't good. What it means is the player didn't really understand what they're supposed to do with the spell. If you are wondering how Fog Cloud works mechanically, you aren't alone. I've done a video to explain it, and I'll link that in the video description. If you do understand how it works mechanically, and you know when to use it, then Fog Cloud can be good. And for what it does, it's also really reliable. There's no saving throw, it just works. So I'm ranking Fog Cloud as purple. If you make your party with decisions based around the spell being cast, it's really good. Otherwise, I think it's reasonably good if you understand when and how to use it. Next up, Goodberry. This is a single action cast that creates 10 magical berries that last for 24 hours. The berries can be consumed with your action, healing 1 hit point and providing 1 day's worth of nourishment. That's 1 filling berry. So if you're just healing up outside of combat, a single Goodberry spell will out-heal any other spell of the level. And because they heal 1 hit point each, there's never any waste. You can distribute them exactly as you want. With a duration of 24 hours, you can also have goodberry still active from the previous day after you take a long rest and you recover the spell slot you used to cast them in the first place. As written, it doesn't say you can feed a goodberry to an ally that's unconscious like you could a healing potion, though Jeremy Crawford has said he would allow that, and I generally see it allowed at tables that I play at. Since we're talking about what the designers say, they also say that if you have a single level of Life Cleric, you can now heal 40 hit points with a single goodberry spell. I'm not sure I agree with their ruling, but you can find this ruling in Sage Advice. This spell is only on the Druid and Ranger spell lists, and it's a big draw to both these classes. Now I need to qualify my rating somewhat. If you are playing with a DM who doesn't allow you to feed goodberries to others or the Life Cleric boost, then this might be a green spell. Still a good spell, but in that case, if you were to prepare it, you would probably also want to prepare a healing spell for downed allies. But if either of these options are allowed, I think you gotta rank it blue, because either the amount of potential healing becomes head and shoulders above all other healing options, or it becomes the most efficient option to bring down allies in combat, or both. Moving on, we get to Healing Word, and the order of presentation is handy here, because comparatively, if goodberry is allowed to be fed to others, I think Healing Word looks pretty poor in that comparison. That said, let's look at Healing Word on its own merits. It's a bonus action to cast, and sometimes that's a good thing. There can be this misunderstanding that bonus actions are like free actions, but unless you had nothing else to do with your bonus action, and you had no plans to cast any other spells but cantrips on your turn, that's not really true. Still, bonus action casting can be advantageous, especially when you don't have anything to do with your bonus action, and the Druid class itself has nothing built in for bonus actions. Some subclasses do, but not all of them. One nice thing about Healing Word is it has a 60-foot range, which really does add to the flexibility. The actual healing is pretty small, D4 plus your Wisdom modifier, and upcasting this is really not paying off because it's the D4 that scales with the level. So you scale this up to 3rd level for an extra 5 hit points of healing to a single target. That is a terrible trade-off. What Healing Word tends to be used for, and is pretty good at, is bringing up a downed ally. You can usually do this without moving, and you can still take an action for something else on your turn, except for casting a leveled spell. So Healing Word is still good. I have seen this as overrated. I mean, really overrated. But if you are looking for a way to bring up a downed ally in combat, Healing Word is not automatically your best choice, but it's a good one. And if I'm not a Circle of Dreams Druid, and I can't feed goodberry to allies, which as written don't permit that, I think this is a pretty solid spell selection, and it gets a green rank. Next up is Ice Knife. This is an action cast, and you throw a shard of ice at a creature within 60 feet. The shard then explodes, doing area of effect damage. If you want to deliver damage to multiple creatures at range with a 1st level spell, this is our option. The primary target potentially takes additional damage from the impact. We make a spell attack roll, and we do a d10 piercing damage on a hit. The target and all other creatures within 5 feet of it make dexterity saves or take 2d6 cold damage. This is one of those spells that, if they make the saving throw, they don't take any of the damage. If you hit a medium or smaller creature with this, you're getting the square the target is in, plus all the squares around it, for a total of 9 squares affected. If the creature is bigger than medium, there's more squares, and thus more secondary targets, in theory, could be affected by this. Still, I wouldn't expect to hit a lot of creatures with this. 2 or 3 is generally what I see. And the damage, it's not that great, because only the primary target can take the d10 piercing, and that's only on a hit. And the other targets are only taking 2d6, and that's just on a failed save. This spell can, and sometimes does, deliver no damage at all. But this spell is still ranged area of effect damage. That is a 1st level spell, and that alone gives it special status. And it can do okay damage. I mean, I would say it does less than other area of effect damage spells, but not a lot less. This is not a spell I would likely keep prepared beyond the first couple levels though, but at level 1 it can be okay, and for that I'm going to give it a purple rank. On to jump. One action to cast, you touch a creature, and their jump distance is tripled for 1 minute. There's no concentration, and let's just consider how valuable this is. First off, jumping counts as your movement. So let's pretend the target of this spell has a 10 strength and a 30-foot movement rate. Normally, this creature could make a running jump of up to 10 feet, but with the jump spell they could now jump up to 30 feet with a running jump. But if they want to make a running jump, they need to move 10 feet on the ground first. Then they can jump, but they only have 20 feet of movement left, so they can either jump 20 feet or they would have to use a dash to get the 30-foot jump. And with 1 minute duration, this isn't a spell that lasts very long either. So if a use comes up for it in combat, we're probably using that action in combat to apply it. And even then, only if we're in touch range. The problem with this spell is it's obviously going to be circumstantial. Why is the duration 1 minute? It should have a much longer duration. That could make this worthwhile as a spell selection some of the time. But this has the problems of both being circumstantial and not very strong. And combined, frankly, I cannot justify an orange rank. This gets a red ranked, unfortunately. Speaking of movement enhancers, our next spell is Longstrider. This is also a one-action cast and targets a creature we touch, but in this case we're increasing the target's speed by 10 feet, and it lasts 60 times longer than the jump spell. This one also doesn't use concentration. So this spell is a lot better than jump. That 1 hour duration is just so much more practical, allowing us to cast this outside of combat and still expect to benefit from it in combat. And that makes all the difference. If I have to use an action in combat to do something that's a relatively minor effect, it's probably not worth that action. But if I can cast it outside of combat, then I'm just using a spell slot for a minor effect in combat, and that might be worth it. Secondly, I think the speed increase is probably more widely useful than the jump distance. This isn't just walking speed either. If you have climbing speed, swimming speed, flying speed, whatever, it is a 10-foot speed bonus. Basically, if something gives you a bonus to speed and it doesn't specify what kind of speed it is, then it is all your speeds. This can be a really useful spell. It's never super powerful though, but it is decent. I don't think it's useful enough to prepare it or cast it at low levels though. I wouldn't take this on a first level druid. This is more of a spell that if I had some extra slots, I can provide a nice moderate mobility boost to someone without using up my concentration. So for low levels, I likely would not prepare this, but I think it holds more value at higher levels. And I think overall, this is a purple spell. It's okay. Next spell is Protection from Evil and Good. This is the only spell at first level that doesn't appear on the base spell list, but is an optional add-on from Tash's Cauldron of Everything. This is a touch spell that lasts up to 10 minutes using our concentration. Target imposes disadvantage to be attacked by aberrations, celestials, elementals, fae, fiends, and undead. The spell recipient also can't be charmed, frightened, or possessed by them if they aren't already when the spell is cast. If they are already, it gives them advantage on saving throws against the effect. But I should point out, if they aren't getting additional saving throws, then this isn't helping you. So, if you're not fighting the right kind of creatures, this is useless. If you are, then it protects one party member and it uses your concentration. And that can be worthwhile, but it's going to pay off a lot more in a party where we can predict or control the target of enemy attacks, and that changes from party to party. In those cases, though, this can be really good, well worth our concentration. There are also a fair number of creatures involved here. 6 different creature types. I find you don't encounter a lot of hostile celestials or fae, but aberrations, elementals, fiends, and undead, they're all fairly common. So this can be quite good, if it's used correctly. But it is obviously circumstantial because there are still tons of creatures that it doesn't protect against at all, and it requires the right party member to use it on. As a self-buff, I'd probably say this isn't very good, because it is using our concentration. So, between those two things, this spell isn't a bad spell, but it is an orange spell. Next up is Purify Food and Drink. This is a one-action cast, but we can also ritually cast it, and it purifies all food and drink in a 5-foot sphere within 10 feet of us and neutralizes any poison or disease in it. Are there cases where this could hypothetically come up as a useful spell? Of course. Should you expect and prepare for them? No, not remotely. Yes, this can be cast without a spell slot, but we are still investing a spell preparation here, and I just don't think there's a reasonable chance you're going to need this. And I think that's fairly self-apparent. I mean, if it's just about our own food, goodberry. But our water, maybe. So why not orange? Well, because when I rate a spell as orange, it's a circumstance that doesn't come up very often. But this case, we're talking about a circumstance that I probably wouldn't expect to come up at all in most campaigns. So I'm ranking this red, but you know what? I have prepared this spell myself. I know I referenced Tome of Annihilation before, but in my case, that's when I prepared it, because you have this long overland travel where water is plentiful, but clean drinking water is scarce. So I used this ritual to bypass that problem, but only because I knew of the unusual circumstance we needed to take care of. I never would have prepared it if that wasn't the case. And honestly, in most campaigns, you just aren't ever going to need this, like, ever. Next spell is Snare. This is going to be an out-of-combat casting because it has a 1-minute casting time. This spell creates an immobile magic trap that lasts for 8 hours or until it's triggered. So, you use a rope for this, which the spell consumes, and you get a 5-foot radius trap on the floor. If someone steps on the trap, they make a dexterity saving throw, or they're caught. So, just like a standard rope snare, it grabs your foot, hoists you upside down, and you are restrained. So why wouldn't you just make a normal snare trap? Well, in this case, this spell effect is invisible. The trapped creature gets an additional save at the end of each of their turns, freeing themselves on a success, or alternatively, they can be freed by someone else using their action and making an Arcana check against your spell DC. So, when somebody is trapped by this, don't expect them to remain trapped for several minutes. Not going to happen. There are basically 2 ways I know of to use this spell with any degree of effectiveness. The first is to trap a route you know an enemy is going to take as part of an ambush, or help defend an area against attack. It's important we know the route fairly precisely though, as this is covering a 5-foot radius only, so that's 4 squares on the battlefield, and we need to have that prep time, and have the enemy either come to us or use a route we know they'll take. Something like maybe a hallway would work well. The second is to use it on the battlefield in a combat where we had a chance to set up defenses beforehand. Then we can either manipulate or move that enemy into the spell. Both of these require circumstances I would not normally count on, and even in those circumstances, I don't think this is an overly dramatic spell. I think it barely ranks orange. I think it can be ineffective when building up defenses or planning an ambush, but neither of these circumstances are coming up all that often, and if they don't come up, I don't think you'll be able to use this in a way that's worth a slot. Our next spell is Speak with Animals. This is a 1-action cast, or if we have the 10 minutes, we can ritually cast it. The spell itself is pretty self-explanatory, and you can cast this, and for 10 minutes you can speak with animals. There's no concentration. This doesn't make the animals necessarily friendly towards you, but it does say at the DM's discretion, you may be able to convince the animal to perform a small favor. Early in this video I talked about animal friendship, and I mentioned there may be an additional use of it that could be combined with methods of communication with those animals, and this would be the method that's available to any druid. Combining animal friendship and speak with animals though, that's 2 spell preparations. That's a major investment, so consider that. On its own though, there is definitely some circumstantial use, particularly for information gathering. The spell mentions that the animals you speak to could likely give you some information about nearby locations and monsters, and that's not bad for a ritual cast. I'm not sure I'd be anxious to spend a spell slot to potentially get some general information like that, but if I can do it without a spell slot, that's not bad. Most areas also have at least some kind of animal, whether it's birds, rats, whatever, so I don't think this is just an outdoor spell either. So I think this is purple. It's okay, but I think you can live without it. Our final spell is Thunderwave. I've seen this one a lot at low levels. Players do like to blast. Thunderwave covers a 15-foot cube adjacent to our character, so on a standard 2-dimensional map, that's 9 squares. Creatures within the area make a Constitution save, and if they fail, they take 2d8 thunder damage and are pushed 10 feet away from our character. If they make their save, they take half damage. So the most comparable spell on our list so far is Ice Knife, and the damage is comparable. Ice Knife has better range, but Thunderwave has the pushback. I personally prefer Thunderwave of the two because if the creatures do make their saving throw, they at least take half damage. I hate casting a spell where nothing happens at all. This needs multiple targets to be worthwhile though. Frankly, I would probably be hesitant to cast it unless I could hit 3 creatures. Unless I could hit 2 creatures and that 10-foot pushing was going to be really great, like pushing them into a spike growth or something. Generally, if you're looking for an area of effect damage spell at first level and you don't have many options, Thunderwave is a pretty good one, even on a wizard. So if that's the kind of spell you're looking for, I think Thunderwave is normally the way to go with Druid. The 2d8 doesn't hold up as you level up though. It's not worth upcasting for 1 extra die. So at first level this is decent. At higher levels it becomes a really unreliable pushing spell that uses a spell slot. So I'm ranking it purple, but I wouldn't hang on to it at higher levels. And that is our first level spell list. We have a couple of really amazing standouts here. Blue ratings for both Entangle and Goodberry. And I should point out that neither are summoning spells, nor are either of them available to wizards. So we really do see the Druid getting their own useful niche in casting right from level 1. In our next video, which is going to be available 1 week from today, we're going to move on to 2nd level Druid spells, and we'll see more of the same. Some really excellent spells that are not widely available. But our Druid is going to have a lot of fun with these spells. I hope you'll join me for that, but until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.